Hello and welcome back. My name is David Loya. I'm the Community Development Director for the City of Arcata, and I've been involved in the city's coastal and sea level rise planning efforts for around 16 years. I'm making these videos to share information with our community to have productive engagement on this important topic. Welcome to Sea Level Rise Adaptation Planning Part 2. This video is the second of a two-part series focusing on the timelines related to sea level rise impacts and the ramifications of different adaptation responses on the people in our community. In this video, we will concentrate on the impacts different policy options may have on our community. We'll also take a closer look at what the current proposal is and the rationale behind it. In part one of the series, we focused on the projected timelines for different types of impacts that may result from sea level rise. Let's recap those here. 2 feet of sea level rise is 60 to 90 years out, depending on the model. And 3 feet of sea level rise is 70 to 125 years out, again, depending on the model. And these are based on the most likely scenarios. The community will have a considerable amount of time to plan, prepare, and execute strategies to manage increasing flood risk and to move uses that will be threatened in the future. And with the likely level of sea level rise 2 to 3 feet, we can protect the South G Street neighborhood for 65 to 125 years based on these models. These protections would include nature-based and restorative practices rather than relying on hard armoring. I'll discuss those in more detail later. Given the long lead times until the areas are affected by regular flooding that cannot be managed, we need to think about the impact of sea level rise policies on the various sectors that will be affected today. For example, if we have a policy that does not allow a homeowner to rebuild if their home has flood damage, will they be able to obtain insurance for their home? Would banks be willing to lend on home sales in this area? Would the current homeowners lose all value in their homes? Is this an equitable solution to the impacts of sea level rise? Let's look at these sectors and the questions raised in each in the South G Street neighborhood. This area has a variety of uses. Climate policy will affect the vulnerable communities that live in the neighborhood, businesses and jobs, as well as recreational uses. There are also potentially contaminated sites that will have environmental impacts not addressed before they are tidally influenced. And our wastewater treatment plant is in this area. This serves the entire city. These human factors also have a financial component. In total, there is about $140 million in property value in this neighborhood. In addition, the region produces about $60,000 in sales tax and $450,000 in property tax annually. These revenues are used by the city to provide services to the entire community. These are the first order fiscal variables associated with this neighborhood. As mentioned earlier, certain policy decisions around redevelopment, for example, would impact other sectors negatively today, despite the long lead times to the actual impacts on the properties. Climate policy that is responsive to fiscal impact will consider several factors. We estimate that we could protect this area from up to 3 feet of sea level rise using primarily nature-based solutions for about $30 million in today's dollars. With no increase in economic activity, the area would generate double this amount in the approximately 60-year time frame to 3 feet of sea level rise. A policy that is too aggressive, prohibiting uses in this area early, would have negative effect on the property values, the businesses in the area today, even before modest impacts start affecting these properties. Now let's consider direct and indirect effects of sea level rise and policy in these sectors in more detail. This is the residential neighborhood to the north of the South G Street neighborhood. And it's largely a mix of single family and multifamily uses. We'll take a look down the street from where the star is located, and you can see the single family portion of this neighborhood. About 15% of the residents in this area are homeowners. These homes are their primary asset, providing housing security and, for some, an inheritance to their families. The policy impacts that we discussed earlier about very aggressive policies to relocate these uses would have direct effects on these individuals. Many of the residents in this area overall are renters with few resources or other options if they were told to relocate now. So these residents would experience individual effects if they were displaced by sea level rise policy, and that would happen well before the impacts of sea level rise. These residents will disproportionately be affected by sea level rise as well, and the city's proposed policy needs to be sensitive to that fact. Most of these folks have nowhere to go to relocate and the financial resources to move. There was another home, even if there was another home available in Arcata. So that points out one of the policy areas that we need to work on is creating more housing in Arcata so that we can accommodate relocation. Looking at the other part of the neighborhood, which is more industrial and commercial. This industrial area has legacy uses that include scrap yards and heavy equipment storage yards. These legacy uses will release contamination into Humboldt Bay if they are not addressed before sea level rise is inundating these sites, as mentioned earlier. Our policy is going to have a profound effect on the environment, depending on the choices we make. The policy proposes to allow and encourage redevelopment of these sites with new, cleaner uses that are more resilient to sea level rise. Policies that discourage reinvestment would essentially mean that this site would stay exactly as it is today with no financial incentive to remove the scrap, the metal, and the contamination. So let's zoom out and look at the entire neighborhood and talk about some of the things that we're planning for. In this area, we're proposing a new zoning type called commercial visitor serving. This area is most vulnerable to sea level rise, but this new zoning we expect will incentivize redevelopment of properties. Future uses such as RV parks will have a better financial return for the owner, clean up the sites, reduce environmental impacts, and be resilient to moderate rates of flooding. And it'll be easy to implement retreat when the use is no longer viable in these sites. And so the city's proposing to reinvest in this area, incentivize the reinvestment by the private sector in uses that allow for a reasonable rate of return on those investments, with the knowledge that this area is located in a place that may be subject to flooding in the future. But again, we need to have a place to relocate those uses. A rapid retreat policy would sink property value and sales tax, but a measured policy would create new sources of revenue to replace those sources that we're losing in this area. So a more measured policy that incentivizes reinvestment, environmental cleanup, and relocation to other areas in the city that are planned for redevelopment would create a fiscal structure that supports city services and private industry. And we can make these changes over the next 20 to 40 to 60 years. In this way, we can use the time we have available to plan for relocating the treatment plant as well, and developing restoration incentives for other properties that are vulnerable. But to do this, we need to buy time to develop new homes and businesses elsewhere in the city while maintaining activities in this existing neighborhood during that transition time. Okay, to recap, we'll use the time leading into sea level rise effects to adopt plans, seek funding, and attract investment that will help accomplish our adaptation and retreat goals in ways that do not disrupt the quality of life for Arcatans. Zooming out even further, we need to consider the area surrounding the South G Street area. The lower lying areas around Wiggy, the WIAT name for Humboldt Bay, are agricultural or public resource lands primarily. These have a completely different set of characteristics and a completely different adaptation approach proposed. In this area, much of the land is owned by public entities. This land has been methodically purchased over the last several decades for public trust and lower impact uses. The city, in partnership with several resource agencies, has restored some of this area, like the McDaniel Slough area seen here. This was transformed from a diked agricultural field to a tidal habitat that includes at least 4 distinct habitat types. This also provides an example of the soft approach to sea level rise adaptation, ways to lay back uses and have setback levees. And these are some of the more ecologically minded approaches that we have in our current planning for sea level rise. Here are some of the other restoration sites the city has completed or is currently working on. You can get more information on that from Environmental Services with the city. So in this area, the city is focused on habitat migration and restoration as tidewaters reach further inland, and flood protection would follow in suit. Instead of hard armoring, the city would focus on nature-based solutions like levees with long transitions to other habitat types, retreating where practical, and using levees with new habitat zones built into them. This has led to a two-phased approach. In Zone 1, the areas that we focused on initially, there's a strategy to plan for longer-term relocation of these uses. Whereas in Zone 2, you see here in yellow, the plan is to initiate restorations, eco-levees, and these long transition levee habitat zones. So Arcata proposes a scaled approach in each of these zones that will allow the city and its residents and businesses to continue to enhance flood and stormwater infrastructure over time while preparing for long-term relocation. I want to close by recognizing the many agencies, consultants, and tribes that are working on these issues in Humboldt. Thank you for allowing me to share Arcata's proposed approach to sea level rise. I hope it facilitates continued dialogue and better understanding about the broad implications of sea level rise policy will have on the people in our communities. That concludes part 2 of our sea level rise adaptation planning deep dive into the timelines, planning, and action, and the downstream impacts. Please reach out to share your feedback and continue to engage with the city in this